My intention in this series, of course, is to show a method of interpretation of the revelation that will hopefully render us at least a willingness to take a look at whether this has actually been fulfilled in the past or not. And I'm a proponent, of course, of that it has been, because I've been studying this book a long, long time. Like I said last time, that I actually found the newspaper notices that when I was in the newspaper in 1978, about my desire to be able to interpret this book for people, primarily because, of course, as a child, you get an interpretation of Revelation from a futurist perspective, whereas you're quite scared about all the different beasts, especially with the translation that was used. It's all a mysterious thing, but it was going to be a horror, and a lot of people were going to get killed and run out, and especially church people were all going to have to observe various strict notions by the government or lose their lives. So this is the second part, and last time I talked about the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord, and we looked at some Old Testament passages, those from the prophets, and saw that the day of the Lord was a euphemism for the destruction of Jerusalem, primarily the religion of the Jews at that time, but also of the actual physical premises of Israel, Judea, and the temple itself. I want to give you a little taste for the first half of this program of Josephus and his description of the Jewish war. This is just a short excerpt compared with the actual book that he wrote about this. In fact, he wrote two books, one in Greek, one in Aramaic. The Aramaic one itself was something like a cryptic book to let the Jews know that were in the dispersion what was going on in Jerusalem. And he wrote up until the destruction of Jerusalem. Then after that, he was shipped off. And from 70 to 73, he used Roman sources to decide how the whole thing ended. But the war itself was 7 years, starting in 66 and going to 73 AD. And some short time before that, you might have heard of the Neronic persecution, where the first Roman emperor, to persecute believers, used believers, Christians and Jews, as the target of the retribution of the people against the burning of Rome. Nero fiddled while Rome burned, probably more like he played the lyre while Rome burned, but not one way or the other. The thought is that Nero burned the entire city of Rome because it stunk so bad, and he had an alternative city to build there that he intended to call Neropolis, including a great, great gold castle. And those plans were laid, but the old city was there and he had to get rid of it. When he did, and the people didn't appreciate that because it was a devastating fire, then he had to find a scapegoat. And the scapegoat that he found, of course, were Christians and Jews, Nazarene-style Jews. And I'm not so far as, I'm going to say, I'm thinking that maybe Nero actually got his list of Jews to persecute or Gentile believers to persecute through his being read and given the papyruses of Paul. We read in the letters between Paul and Seneca, Seneca being the guardian for Nero and a counselor there toward the end, that Seneca had shared Paul's manuscripts with Nero and with his queen, Pompeia, and that they were not well disposed toward them. But as you know, in most of Paul's letters, there is at the end greetings, and there, especially in Romans 16, there are a lot of people greeted in that letter. Philippians 4 is another one. 1 Timothy 4 is another one. Some of those people we can identify, including some senators, some prominent Druids in Rome, and a few other people that had prominency in that area. And it might have given Nero a place to start and maybe an idea of who to lay the blame on. But that's for another session. Right now, I'm going to share the screen with you for my notes and just let you listen to a section of the Jewish War that I recorded some time ago. Because most people, believers, don't know anything about this. And thus, if you don't know history, you're bound to make the mystery more mysterious than it even is.
Whereas the war the Jews made against the Romans has been the greatest of all times, while some men who were not concerned themselves have written vain and contradictory stories by hearsay, and while those that were there have given...
Can you hear that? Could you hear the recording?
Yes, I did.
Okay, good.
False accounts, I, Joseph, the son of Matthias, by birth a Hebrew, and a priest also, and who at first fought against the Romans myself, and was forced to be present at what was done afterwards, am the author of this book. Now the affairs of the Romans were in great disorder after the death of Nero. At the decease of Herod, Agrippa, his son, who bore the same name, was 17 years old. He was considered too young to bear the burden of royalty, and Judea relapsed into a Roman province. Cuspius Fadus was sent as governor, and administered his office with firmness, but found civil war disturbing the district beyond Jordan. He cleared the country of the robber bands, and his successor, Tiberius Alexander, during a brief rule, put down disturbances that broke out in Judea. The province was at peace till he was superseded by Cumanus, during whose government the people and the Roman soldiery began to show mutual animosity. In a terrible riot, 20,000 people perished, and Jerusalem was given up to wailing and lamentation. It was in Caesarea that the events took place that led to the final war. This magnificent city was inhabited by two races, the Syrian Greeks, who were heathens, and the Jews. The two parties violently contended for the preeminence. The Jews were the more wealthy, but the Roman soldiery, levied chiefly in Syria, took part with their countrymen. Tumults and bloodshed disturbed the streets. At this time a procurator named Gessius Florus was appointed, and he, by his barbarities, forced the Jews to begin the war in the 12th year of the reign of Nero and the 17th of the reign of Agrippa. But the occasion of the war was by no means proportioned to these heavy calamities that it brought upon us. The fatal flame finally broke out from the old feud at Caesarea. The decree of Nero had assigned the magistracy of the city to the Greeks. It happened that the Jews had a synagogue, the ground around which belonged to a Greek. For this spot the Jews offered a much higher price than it was worth. It was refused, and to annoy them as much as possible, the owner set up some mean buildings and shops upon it, and so made the approach to the synagogue as narrow and difficult as possible. The more impetuous of the Jewish youth interrupted the workmen. Then the men of greater wealth and influence, and among them John, a publican, collected the large sum of 8 talents and sent it as a bribe to Florus, that he might stop the building. He received the money, made great promises, and at once departed for Sebast from Caesarea. His object was to leave full scope for the riot. On the following day, while the Jews were crowding to the synagogue, a citizen of Caesarea outraged them by oversetting an earthen vessel in the way, over which he sacrificed birds, as done by the law in cleansing lepers, and thus he implied that the Jews were a leprous people. The more violent Jews, furious at the insult, attacked the Greeks who were already in arms. The Jews were worsted, took up the books of the law, and fled to Narbata, about 7 miles distant. John the publican and 12 men of eminence went to Samaria to Florus, implored his aid, and reminded him of the 8 talents he had received. He threw them into prison and demanded 17 talents from the sacred treasury under pretense of Caesar's necessities. This injustice and oppression caused violent excitement in Jerusalem when the news reached that city. The people assembled around the temple with the loudest outcries. But it was the purpose of Florus to drive the people to insurrection, and he gave his soldiers orders to plunder the upper market. Of men, women, and children, there fell that day 3,600. When Agrippa attempted to persuade the people to obey Florus until Caesar should send someone to succeed him, the more seditious cast reproaches on him and got the king excluded from the city. Nay, some had the impudence to fling stones at him. At the same time, they excited the people to go to war, and some laid siege to the Roman garrison in the Antonia. Others made an assault on a certain fortress called Masada. They took it by treachery and slew the Romans. One, Menahem, a Galilean, became leader of the sedition and went to Masada and broke open Herod's armory and gave arms not only to his own people, but to other robbers also. These he made use of for a bodyguard, and returned in state to Jerusalem and gave orders to continue the siege of the Antonia. The tower was undermined and fell, and many soldiers were slain. Next day the high priest, Ananias, and his brother Hezekiah were slain by the robbers. By these successes Menahem was puffed up and became barbarously cruel. But he was slain, as were also the captains under him, in an attack led by Eleazar, a bold youth who was governor of the temple. And now great calamities and slaughters came on the Jews. On the very same day 2 dreadful massacres happened. In Jerusalem the Jews fell on Netalus and the band of Roman soldiers whom he commanded after they had made terms and had surrendered, and all were killed except the commander himself, who supplicated for mercy and even agreed to submit to circumcision. On that very day and hour, as though Providence had ordained it, the Greeks in Caesarea rose and slew over 20,000 Jews, and so the city was emptied of its Jewish inhabitants. For Florus caught those who escaped and sent them to the galleys. By this tragedy the whole nation was driven to madness. The Jews rose and laid waste the villages all around many sites in Syria, and they descended on Gadara, Hippo, and Gaulonitis, and burned and destroyed many places. Sebast and Ascalon were seized without resistance, and they razed Anthedon and Gaza to the ground. When thus the disorder in all Syria had become terrible, Cestius Gallus, the Roman commander at Antioch, marched with an army to Ptolemais and overran all Galilee and invested Jerusalem, expecting that it would be surrendered by means of a powerful party within the walls. But the plot was discovered, and the conspirators were flung headlong from the walls, and an attack by Cestius on the north side of the temple was repulsed with great loss. Seeing the whole country around in arms, and the Jews swarming on all the heights, Cestius withdrew his army by night, leaving 400 of his bravest men to mount guard in the camp and to display their ensigns, that the Jews might be deceived. But at break of day it was discovered that the camp was deserted by the army, and the Jews rushed to the assault and slew all the Roman band. Nero was at this time in Achaia. To him Cestius, in order to lay the blame on Florus, sent as ambassadors Costobar and Saul, 2 brothers of the Herodian family, who, with Philip, the son of Joachimus, the general of Agrippa, had escaped from Jerusalem. Meantime, a great massacre of the Jews took place at Damascus. Then those in Jerusalem who had pursued after Cestius called a general assembly in the temple, and elected their governors and commanders. Their choice fell on Joseph, the son of Gorion, and Ananias, the chief priest, who were invested with absolute authority in the city. But Eleazar was passed over, for he was suspected of aiming at kingly power as he went about attended by a bodyguard of zealots. But as commanding within the temple, he made himself master of the public treasures, and in a short time the need of money and his extreme subtlety won over the multitude, and all real authority fell into his hands. To the other districts they sent the men most to be trusted for courage and fidelity. Josephus was appointed to the command of Galilee, with particular charge of the strong city of Gamala. He raised in that province in the north an army of more than 100,000 young men, whom he armed and exercised after the Roman manner. And he formed a council of 70, and appointed 7 judges in each city. He sought to unite the people and to win their goodwill. But great trouble arose from the treachery of his enemy, John of Giscala, who surpassed all men in craft and deceit. He gathered a force of 4,000 robbers and wasted Galilee, while he inflamed the dissensions in the city and sent messengers to Jerusalem accusing Josephus of tyranny. Tiberius and several cities revolted, but Josephus suppressed the rising, severely punishing many of the leaders. Jan retired to the robbers at Masada and took to plundering Idumea. Nero, on learning from the messengers the state of affairs, at first regarded the revolt lightly, but presently grew alarmed, and appointed to the command of the armies in Syria and the task of subduing the Jews to Vespasian, who had pacified the West when it was disordered by the Germans, and had also recovered Britain for the Romans. He came to Antioch in the early spring, and was there joined by Agrippa and all his forces. He marched to Ptolemais, where he was met by his son Titus, who had, with expedition unusual in the winter season, sailed from Achaia to Alexandria. So the Roman army now numbered 60,000 horsemen and footmen, besides large numbers of camp followers who were also accustomed to military service and could fight on occasion. The war was now open. Josephus attempted no resistance in the open field, and the people had been directed to flee to the fortified cities. The strongest of all these was Jotapata, and here Josephus commanded in person. Being very desirous of demolishing it, Vespasian besieged it with his whole army. It was defended with the greatest vigor, but after fierce conflicts was taken in the 13th year of the reign of Nero, on the first day of the month of Panemus, that is, July. During this dreadful siege, and at the capture, 40,000 men fell. The Romans sought in vain for the body of Josephus, their stubborn enemy. He had leaped down the shaft of a dry well, leading to a long cavern. A woman betrayed the hiding place, and Josephus was taken and brought before the conqueror, of whom he had demanded from his captors a private conference. To Vespasian he announced that he and his son would speedily attain the imperial dignity. Vespasian was conciliated by the speech of his prisoner, whom he treated with kindness, for though he did not release him from his bonds, he bestowed on him suits of clothes and other precious gifts. Joppa, Tiberias, Tarichae, and Gamala were taken. But Romans and Jews perished in their conflict, and by the capture of Giscala, all Galilee was subdued, John of Giscala fleeing to Jerusalem. While the cities of Galilee thus arrested the course of the Roman eagles, Jotapata and Gamala setting the example of daring resistance, the leaders of the nation in Jerusalem, instead of sending out armies to the relief of the besieged cities, were engaged in the most dreadful civil conflicts. The fame of John of Giscala had gone before him to Jerusalem, and the multitude poured forth to do him honor. He falsely represented the Roman forces as being very greatly weakened, and declared that their engines had been worn out in the sieges in Galilee. He was a man of enticing eloquence, to whom the young men eagerly gave heed. So the city now began to be divided into hostile factions, and the whole of Judea, and the whole of Judea had before set to the people of Jerusalem the fatal example of discord. For every city was torn to pieces by civil animosities. Not only the public councils, but even numerous families were distracted by the peace and war dispute. Through all Judea the youth were ardent for war, while the elders vainly endeavored to allay the frenzy. Bands of desperate men began to spread over the land, plundering houses, while the Roman garrisons in the towns, rather rejoicing in their hatred to the race than wishing to protect the sufferers, afforded little help. Large numbers of these evil men stole into the city and grew into a daring faction, who robbed houses openly, and many of the most eminent citizens were murdered by these zealots, as they were called, from their pretense that they had discovered a conspiracy to betray the city to the Romans. They dismissed many of the Sanhedrin from office and appointed men of the lowest degree, who would support them in their violence till the leaders of the people became slaves to their will. At length resistance was provoked, led by Ananus, oldest of the chief priests, a man of great wisdom, and the robber zealots took refuge in the temple and fortified it more strongly than before. They appointed as high priest one Phanius, a coarse and clownish rustic, utterly ignorant of the sacerdotal duties, who when decked in the robes of office caused great derision. This sport and pastime for the zealots caused the more religious people to shed tears of grief and shame, and the citizens, unable to endure such insolence, rose in great numbers to avenge the outrage on the sacred rites. Thus a fierce civil war broke out, in which very many were slain. Then Jan of Giscala, with great treachery, outwardly siding with Ananus and secretly aiding the zealots, sent messengers inviting the Idumeans to come to his help, of whom 20,000 broke into the city during a stormy night and slew 85,000 people. Nero died after having reigned 13 years and 8 days, and Vespasian, being informed of the event, waited for a whole year, holding his army together instead of proceeding against Jerusalem. Galba was made emperor, and then, after the defeat and death of the emperor Vitellius, Vespasian was proclaimed by the east. He had preferred to leave the Jews to waste their strength by their internal feuds, while he sent his lieutenants with forces to reduce various surrounding districts instead of attacking Jerusalem. When he became emperor, he released Josephus from his bonds, honoring him for his integrity. Hastening his journey to Rome, Vespasian commanded Titus to subdue Judea. At Jerusalem were now 3 factions raging furiously. Eleazar, son of Shimon, who was the first cause of the war, by persuading the people to reject the offerings of the emperors to the temple, and had led the zealots and seized the temple, pretended to cherish righteous wrath against Jan of Giscala for the bloodshed he had occasioned. But he deserted the zealots and seized the inner court of the temple, so that there was war between him and Shimon, son of Gioras. Thus Eleazar, Jan, and Shimon each led a band in constant fightings, and the temple was everywhere defiled by murders. Now, as Titus was on his march, he chose out 600 select horsemen, and went to take a view of the city, when suddenly an immense multitude burst forth from the gate over against the monuments of Queen Helena, and intercepting him and a few others. He had on neither helmet nor breastplate, yet though many darts were hurled at him, all missed him, as if by some purpose of providence, and, charging through the midst of his foes, he escaped unhurt. Part of the army now advanced to Scopus, within a mile of the city, while another occupied a station at the foot of the Mount of Olives. Seeing this gathering of the Roman forces, the factions within Jerusalem for the first time felt the necessity for concord, as Eleazar from the summit of the temple, Jan from the porticos of the outer court, and Shimon from the heights of Zion, watched the Roman camps forming thus so near the walls. Making terms with each other, they agreed to make an attack at the same moment. Their followers, rushing suddenly forth along the valley of Jehoshaphat, fell on the 10th Legion, encamped at the foot of the Mount of Olives, and working there unarmed at the entrenchments. The soldiers fell back, many being killed. Witnessing their peril, Titus, with picked troops, fell on the flank of the Jews and drove them into the city with great loss. The Roman commander now carefully pushed forward his approaches, and the army took up a position all along the northern and the western walls, the footmen being drawn up in 7 lines, with the horsemen in 3 lines behind, and the archers between. Jerusalem was fortified by 3 walls. These were not one within the other, for each defended one of the quarters into which the city was divided. The first, or outermost, surrounded Bethzatha. The next protected the citadel of the Antonia and the northern front of the temple, and the third, or old, and the innermost wall was that of Zion. Many towers, 35 feet high and 35 feet broad, each surrounded with lofty chambers and with great tanks for rainwater, guarded the whole circuit of the walls, 90 being in the first wall, 14 in the second, and 60 in the third. The whole circuit of the city was about 33 stadia, that is 4 miles. From their penthouses of wicker, the Romans, with great toil, day and night, discharged arrows and stones, which slew many of the citizens. At 3 different places the battering rams began their thundering work, and at length the corner tower came down, yet the walls stood firm, for there was no breach. Suddenly the besieged sallied forth and set fire to the engines. Titus came up with his horsemen and slew 12 Jews with his own hands. The Jews now retreated to the second wall, abandoning the defense of Bethzatha, which the Romans entered. Titus instantly ordered the second wall to be attacked, and for 5 days the conflict raged more fiercely than ever. The Jews were entirely reckless of their own lives, sacrificing themselves readily if they could kill their foes. On the 5th day they retreated from the second wall, and Titus entered that part of the lower city that was within it with 1,000 picked men. But being desirous of winning the people, he ordered that no houses should be set on fire, and no massacres should be committed. The seditious, however, slew everyone who spoke of peace, and furiously assailed the Romans. Some fought from the walls, others from the houses, and such confusion prevailed that the Romans retired. Then the Jews, elated, manned the breach, making a wall of their own bodies. Thus the fight continued for 3 days, till Titus a second time entered the wall. He threw down all the northern part and strongly garrisoned the towers of the south, the strong heights of Sion, the citadel of the Antonia, and the fortified temple still held out. Titus, eager to save so magnificent a place, resolved to refrain for a few days from the attack in order that the minds of the besieged might be affected by their woes, and that the slow results of famine might operate. He reviewed his army in full armor, and they received their pay in view of the city, the battlements being thronged by spectators during the splendid defiling, who looked on in terror and dismay. The famine increased, and the misery of the weaker was aggravated by seeing the stronger obtaining food. All natural affection was extinguished. Husbands and wives, parents and children snatching the last morsel from each other. Many wretched men were caught by the Romans prowling in the ravines by night to pick up food, and these were scourged, tortured, and crucified. This was done to terrify the rest, and it went on till there was not wood enough for crosses. Terrible crimes were committed in the city. The aged high priest, Matthias, was accused of holding communication with the enemy. 3 of his sons were killed in his presence, and he was executed in sight of the Romans, together with 16 other members of the Sanhedrin. The famine grew so woeful that a woman devoured the body of her own child. At length, after fierce fighting, the Antonia was scaled, and Titus ordered its demolition. Titus now promised that the temple should be spared if the defenders would come forth and fight in any other place. But Jan and the zealots refused to surrender it. For several days the outer cloisters and outer courts were attacked with rams, but the intense and compact stones resisted the blows. As many soldiers were slain in seeking to storm the cloisters, Titus ordered the gates to be set on fire, though that night and the next day the flames raged through the cloisters. Then, in order to save the temple itself, he ordered the fire to be quenched. On the 10th of August, the same day of the year on which Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple built by Solomon, the cry was heard that the temple was on fire. The Jews, with cries of grief and rage, grasped their swords and rushed to take revenge on their enemies or perish in the ruins. The slaughter was continued while the fire raged. Soon no part was left but a small portion of the outer cloisters, where 6,000 people had taken refuge, led by a false prophet, who had there promised that Elohim would deliver his people in his temple. The soldiers set the building on fire, and all perished. Titus next spent 18 days in preparations for the attack on the upper city, which was then speedily captured. And now the Romans were not disposed to display any mercy, night alone putting an end to the carnage. During the whole of this siege of Jerusalem, 1,100,000 were slain, and the prisoners numbered 97,000. To end this story, let me add the aftermath. The Romans laid the city bare. Bodies were stacked like cords of firewood. Everyone fell by the sword or fire. General Titus commanded his legions not to destroy or burn the temple, but they disobeyed and set it ablaze. Hundreds of Levites ran into the burning temple rather than become Roman casualties. It was so hot in there that the millions of pounds of silver and gold melted. The precious metal liquefied and ran like water out of the cracks in the stone. Soldiers pried these massive stones apart for the boiling loot. When the Romans were finished, the temple, its money, and all inside were totally annihilated. An eyewitness tells the incredible story about one of the Levitical priests. When the smoke had risen in thick columns and the flames leapt through the roof of the grand structure, one of the priests climbed to the top of the highest temple tower with the key to the holy place in his hand. Atop the pinnacle of the temple, in smoke and flames, he held the key high and cried, "Yahweh, if you do no longer judge us worthy to run your house, take the key back." A giant hand descended out of the clouds of smoke and took away the key as the priest succumbed to the flames.
Wow. That's just a little bit of the Jewish war. What they didn't go into there was what happened before Jerusalem much, or what happened after. But Jerusalem was, I guess you would call that the pinnacle of the temple of the war, because that is, after 3.5 years of fighting, that is the destruction that happened. And then after that, in the aftermath, it was pretty much a mop-up. But as you heard in there, the war started at Masada, which was a Roman garrison at that time, and some zealots had gotten up there and gotten rid of the Romans and taken it over. And it ended then in 73 at Masada as well. And I'm sure that you know the story behind that ending. Revelation is not a prophecy. It's a fulfillment of a prophecy. It is the fulfillment that has been observed from on high, which I understand to be in Jerusalem from on high, that the writer of this knows what's going on there because he's in the Spirit on the day of the Lord, on the day of Yahweh, when Jerusalem and Israel was going to find the retribution of Yahweh that had been promised throughout the Old Testament prophets. This was it. Not only the day of Yahweh and the destruction of Jerusalem, but also the end of the age. When you read in your scripture, end times, it's not talking about our times. If you read last days, it is talking about our times, which we'll get on with next time. I'll explain that. But the end of the age, or as the King James translates it, at the end of the world, that was 70 AD. Matthew 24 is Yahshua's prophecy to the believers then of what would happen in 40 years. And that fulfillment is found both in Josephus and in the Revelation. So I wanted to look at the rest of the time here in Matthew 24 to see how accurate this is. If you compare Mark 13 and Matthew 24, they're both Olivet prophecies. Mark 13 is less, Matthew is more. And the question is, was he writing prophecy, or was he writing what else happened? Masada happened in 73, yes, but the day of the Lord prophecy happened 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, as well as the religion. Matthew 24:1, and having gone forth, Yahshua departed from the temple. I need to highlight that, because that is the crux of what we're talking about this whole time. And his disciples came near to show him the buildings of the temple. And Yahshua said to them, do you see all these? Amen, amen, I say to you, there may not be left here a stone upon stone that shall not be thrown down. We find that in Luke chapter 19 as well, which maybe we'll get to today. And when he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, notice, in this literal translation, it's not past tense. It's historical present tense. It makes you feel like you're there. Most of the Gospels are written in historical tense, like it's happening now. It's unfortunate that our translators again put these in aorist or past tense for us, reminding us, yes, that they did happen, but in a very real way, they should be happening in our lives now. Yahshua is here on the Mount of Olives. Mount Moriah is where the temple sat. And this puts Yahshua on his own mountain. You know, the symbolism for mountains was power and authority. His is the Mount of Olives. The one of the temple was Mount Moriah. And you can see that right there he is sitting higher. Higher. Down here's hell, Hinnom Valley. When he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came near to him by himself, saying, tell us, when shall these be? And he does tell us a little later on. He answers that question. And what is the sign of your presence? That word is parousia. It does not mean coming. It means presence. If you think about that, that's going to make a lot of difference in your theology. What's the sign of your presence and of the full end? The full end. The synatelios of the, some say, world. But we know other places in the New Testament, the world never ends. It's the end of the age. We can see that word right here. Ionos. Syntelios to Ionos. End of the age. The end of the age was the end of Jerusalem as a Jewish capital. And Yahshua answering said to them, take heed that no one may lead you astray. My friends, since 1844, people have been leading us astray to such an extent as to continually putting this prophecy in the future, when it's not a prophecy at all, continuing to put it in the future in order to make ways for those that are putting it there to continue their industry, continue making merchandise of the gospel. It started in 1844 with John Darby. Now leave that for just a little bit. But in that first century, even up to the time of Yahshua, they knew about false messiahs. because there had been some already. Yehuda, Yaakov, and Shimon of Gamala, or he's also known as Judas the Galilean, in 6 AD, when the tyrant King Archelaus died and the taxes went up like crazy. Judas the Galilean called for the destruction of all records. And if we're to understand what the commentators of that time said, he called himself Messiah, and the people did too. And there is a lot of speculation today that Judas, Jacob, and Simon of Gamala that came forth in 6 AD were the forebears of Yahshua and his family. Another one that's mentioned is Theudas. Mentioned, I think, in Acts chapter 6. Like these Judas and Theudas, they came along and they talked like they were something. And Gamaliel says, let's just see what happens. Theudas here has been recognized even as the brother of Yahshua. When you read in Josephus what Theudas did, and you read what Toma did, Thomas, Judas, Didymus Thomas, the brother of Yahshua, did, they're equal. There's the Taheb, that is the Samaritan Messiah, that called the people up to rebuild the temple on top of Mount Gerizim in Samaria. And the Romans cut them down on the way up, killed them all. The Egyptians, spoken of in the book of Acts, they think Paul is the Egyptian in Acts 21. Simon Magus proclaimed himself to be the Elohim. And Saul of Tarsus, some even think of him as a messianic figure because of what we just read in Josephus or heard. Saul and Costobarus think of Paul and Barnabas, so close together, kindred of Herod. I'm not cutting down Paul right now, believe me. I'm just saying it seems like quite a coincidence that the timing and the name should be so together. Even Paul tells us that he is Herodian. And then there's Simon Zelotes, another brother of Yahshua, who took over the assembly in Jerusalem from James. Simon Zelotes was finally crucified at the end of the century, but we see him as bringing the Nazarenes out of Jerusalem when a truce was called by the new emperor, and perhaps he was one that led them out because he was there watching over them in that time. Many shall come in my name, saying, I am the anointed one, the Messiah, and they shall lead many astray. And here are the three that we were talking about in the diatribe there, who equate to, when we get into it, the three frogs coming out of the mouth of the false prophet, messianic types, and even Flavius Vespasianus, the general Vespasian. Josephus himself called Vespasian the Messiah, pointing to the Balaam prophecy, the star prophecy in Numbers, saying that one would rise up in this land and become the ruler of the world. Vespasian kept him from being executed for that reason. He said, we'll wait and see if this comes true, Vespasian being a very superstitious man. And if it's true, then I'll exalt you. And sure enough, Josephus gave a true prophecy to some extent, and he became an adopted son of the general who would become the emperor. In Revelation 16:13, I saw coming from the mouth of the dragon and from the mouth of the beast and from the mouth of the false prophet 3 unclean spirits like frogs. We have yet to define beast, false prophet, etc. But that will come, you probably already know. For these are the spirits of demons performing signs, which are going out to the rulers of the whole world. Now, whole world in the Revelation or in any other New Testament book is a coded phrase. Somebody keeps hitting the chat here. Okay. Anyone can believe what they want. I will never criticize you for your belief if it's informed. In the Greek authors who wrote about the Roman affairs, the equivalent to the Roman Empire, that is the whole world. Because the word there are the three words, pasa, he, oikumene. Oikumene, we get the word economy from that. Oiko means a system or a house, a system, a household. And mena means remain. It's talking about people or inhabitants. It's contextually equivalent to all the subjects of this empire. This comes from a good source, that is Thayer's. So these three come performing signs, going out to the rulers of the whole world, not them, but the signs are. That is, to the ends of the Roman Empire, which they did, to gather them together into the battle of the great day of God, all-powerful. That's the day of the Lord again. We're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the end of the age. And these indeed, they were the three, the zealots that took over Jerusalem, breaking Jerusalem into three parts. And you shall begin to hear of wars and reports of wars. See, don't be troubled, for it befits all to come to pass. But the end, we ask ourselves, the end of what? The end of the world? The world never ends. The end of what? We're talking about, again, the end of the age. The end of the age is not yet. Here's a sign. For a tribe, I mean, your Bible might say nation in there, but the word is ethnoi, tribes, ethne. We get the word ethnic from it. For a tribe will rise against a tribe, a sovereignty against a sovereignty. It says kingdom against king. There were no kingdoms at that time. There were rulerships. So I use the word sovereignty, a better word, not an Elizabethan word. And there shall be famines and earthquakes. Pestilences is not in the better texts, in diverse places, and all these are the beginning of the sorrows, because the beginning of the war was in northern Galilee, around the city of Gamla, the camel. If you've been to Israel, undoubtedly you've seen the camel in the north, city still there that exists on the top of a mountain peak. And on one side of that city, it's just a sheer drop-off. Josephus went to Gamla, where the war started, and fortified the city, thinking nobody would be able to get up there. They put every kind of obstacle in the way up the mountain for the Romans to have to go around, but they did it. And the Romans got to the city, but Josephus snuck out before they got there. And the Romans came in such droves that the people would go to the backside of the city and just jump off. That's the only place they had to go. The city was completely emptied out. This is just one of many, many hardships and horrors that happened to these people as a result of the day of Yahweh, where it says later on that there's never been anything like this before and never will be. Indeed, to look into this is a sad, sad affair, and nothing has ever come close to it for sheer barbarity and death. And you shall begin to hear of wars and reports of wars. See, be not troubled. Why wouldn't that trouble somebody? Because the hope that people had was not in this life, but in their trust in Yahshua's word, that he would rescue. Then they shall deliver you up to tribulation and shall kill you, and you shall be hated by all tribes because of my name. Now, they called these guys in Greek the Yesayans, after the name Yahshua. Yesayans in Rome and certain parts of Palestine. I mentioned the fire that Nero started in Rome. It was the first of two great fires. The other fire was at the same time Rome was burning in 70. But at this first fire, when Yahshua threw the Yesayans to the crowds, I think you probably know what happened, that believers everywhere, all throughout the empire, were arrested, imprisoned, enslaved. In Rome itself, the believers were put up on stakes and lit as torches. Even as Nero kept his parks and reserves that he owned open for people who had lost their homes in the fire, he lit those gardens up at night with the bodies of believers. And we know about the arenas and the games and the terrible hardships that we read about in the Christian martyrs of the earliest centuries. I hope that you've read some of those. They absolutely are true. Or if you haven't, again, get yourself a rental copy of Quo Vadis and watch it. I say this all the time, hoping that you will, because you get a very, very similar idea of what's going on here in these prophecies. The tribulation then began with the Neronic persecution that continued on for the first, well, actually 3.5 years, starting at 64 AD, when Rome burned. So the peoples were hated. Believers were hated, known as atheists, known as cannibals, because of their drinking of blood, and all because of my name, the Assaeans, or the Christians. And then shall many be stumbled, and they shall deliver up one another, and shall hate one another. And I wonder if we were made to say, bow down and pour out a drink libation for the emperor, or worship the emperor, or renounce Messiah, and if we don't, our whole family is killed, tortured, like in the time of the Maccabees, what would we do? Many stumbled. We read about it all the time, if you read these early martyrs. And they're delivered up, and all people were very much separated by this. Believers didn't dare call each other believers. They had to hide. And the sign of the fish, the ichthus, became the sign by which one knew each other. One knew the other one. One of the most active kinds of examples that we still have for the hatred of the Nazarenes is from the second Jewish revolt that happened 60 years later, 70 years later, in 132 to 35 AD, where there was a Messiah named Bar Kokhba. Oh, I think I want to read through this because this has a lot to do with the hatred people had for Nazarenes, Assaeans, Christians, because of their lack of fighting. They had joined, the believers had joined with Bar Kokhba in the second rebellion at first, but then something happened. During the Bar Kokhba rebellion in about 135, Jewish Christians who were called Nazarenes at that time fought alongside Bar Kokhba to drive the Romans out of Israel. When it looked as though the Jews would win, Akiva, the great rabbi, declared that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. And by the way, he changed the calendar. This is why the Jewish calendar is of no use to us, because the change still continues in the calendar of the Jews. When it looked as though the Jews would win, Akiva declared that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. Jewish believers couldn't accept that. They had a Messiah. Back then, it was common knowledge among believers that the Messiah is Yahweh. Declaring that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah was tantamount to idol worship. That's forbidden. Nazarenes withdrew their support, and Bar Kokhba was defeated. Akiva blamed the Nazarenes for the defeat, and he declared that they weren't Jewish, but he didn't stop there. He went on to forbid any contact between Jews and Nazarenes. That became a central part of Jewish tradition, and is still in effect to this day in the 18 benedictions of the synagogue. Although I can't prove it, I have hunched that Akiva harbored residual resentment toward the Messiah of 100 years after his crucifixion and resurrection. He saw an opportunity to inflict what he thought would be a mortal wound to the growing Nazarene community, and he took it. Even now, many Jewish families will disown their relatives, including their own children, if they become believers. In Akiva's day, virtually every Christian was a Jew. Very few Gentiles believers existed. The Nazarenes were a sect of Judaism. That's the sect that we hope to emulate as Essenes, Nazarene Essenes. They were just like Reformed Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews of today, just another sect. They were Jewish by birth and believers by the grace of Yahweh. Akiva had no legal or moral justification or authority to challenge the ancestry of his fellow Jews, and he did, and the people let him get away with it. It made absolutely no sense. Akiva's rulings ranked up there with the most horrendous rabbinical pronouncements ever uttered, and there have been some horrible ones. Problems associated with it reverberate to this day. The only rabbinic ruling that makes less sense than Akiva's is one prohibiting pronouncing the name Yahweh. That one defies logic and the Torah, since Yahweh commanded us to declare his name to the world. That prohibition was instituted in the mid-2nd century BC, and we know where it has led us. Today, most Jewish people don't know Yahweh. They think his name is Hashem or Adonai. Most Jewish people who do know Yahweh's name refuse to say it or declare it. It's part of their tradition. The problem is even worse in the Christian community. Christians think that Yahweh's name is God and Lord. Both of these titles are problematic for more than one reason, but I won't get into that in this editorial. The point is that ridiculous rabbinic rulings have had dreadful consequences. In the Mea Sharim neighborhood of Jerusalem, you would probably still be stoned for saying Yahweh. If you think I'm exaggerating, try it. If you decide to give it a try, be prepared to run as fast as you can, etc. This comes from www.snydertalk.com. I don't think he's a relative, but he's got some good stuff out there. We go on to 24:11. Many false prophets will arise, lead many astray. I scanned personally the church fathers. The futurist view of Revelation didn't come from church fathers in ancient times. It was practically unknown in ancient times. One church father hopes it as a possibility in order to keep, as he says, the friction of possible persecution strong, to keep people strong. But it came in like a flood around 1844 with the preacher John Darby of the Plymouth Brethren, who came upon the dispensationalist position after reading a pamphlet by a Jesuit named Lacunza, who was disguised as Rabbi Ben Ezra. Have you heard of the Scofield Bible? Scofield, in the 20th century, right at the beginning, got a hold of Darbyism. Scofield was a fundraiser. He knew how to make money. He promoted unusual projects. And he published a Bible based on Darbyism in 1906, which was set up with the foundation of Darbyism. And you can read about this at this link, but it's all over in the internet. Look up Lacunza, and it'll tell you about the pamphlet he wrote that talks about some of the very same things that modern dispensationalism talks about today, rapture, etc. Verse 12, and because of the abounding of the lawlessness. And I think about, well, you got to go on and say, the agape of many shall become cold. Lawlessness and agape, or love, what are we talking about here? The kinds of law I was thinking of, Torah is only one. Then there's temple law. There's rabbinical law. There's Roman law. And there's the law of propriety. Josephus talks about the lawlessness in the country, but him being a Pharisee of the highest rank, calling himself, I should say, he was a Sadducee by birth, but he changed to become a Pharisee. In that day, a Pharisee could become a priest. They were interchangeable. I think Josephus is mostly about propriety. What is appropriate for our situation, rather than what is appropriate according to the Torah. Because for 300 years before this, Israelites were not allowed by law to keep the Torah. The governments that came in from foreign powers absolutely forbade it and tried to break up Judaism altogether. Even in this time, as I mentioned before, there were more Greeks in Galilee than there were Jews. 2/3 Greeks or Romans in Galilee. And the main language of all three provinces of Israel was Greek, not Hebrew. In fact, nobody at that time spoke Hebrew as a lingua franca. They simply spoke Greek because everybody knew it. I was talking to some people overseas about languages just this week. This one place, there's 11 languages in this particular place. It's the Philippines. I was looking at some internet stuff. 11 different languages, all very much different, yet they all speak one language, Tagalog. Have you ever heard of it? However, the official language is English. That's something strange. Bounding lawlessness. What kind of law was referred to? And the love, that is the agape, not the phileo love, the agape of many shall become cold. And as Lee Hayhurst likes to say, agape has to do with loving Elohim more than loving people. And that could well be true. The love of people have gotten cold because they didn't follow Torah or because they didn't follow propriety. But the one who did endure to the end, he shall be rescued. Now, I didn't use the word saved in there because saved these days means something quite different. That is personally getting my soul saved up at an altar someplace. In this case, we take the primary meaning of the word sozo, which is rescued or delivered. And this good news of the reign shall be proclaimed in all the world. Again, we look at all the world and we go up to the literary note that we're talking primarily about the world that is the Roman Empire. This is to go out for a testimony to the tribes. Now look, Yahshua had 40 years. 40 years before his prophecy would come to pass. He said that. Couple of places. This generation will live to see this. Or he'll say, this generation will not pass. A biblical generation is always 40 years. So the good news of this reign had only 40 years to go out as a testimony to the tribes. So what is the testimony of the tribes? Again, we have to look to Revelation. Remember I mentioned the first time there are two witnesses there that transform into different symbols throughout. The two witnesses are the word of Yahweh and the testimony of Yahshua. And John himself in Revelation says that that was why he was enduring Patmos for the word and the testimony. And where do we find the testimony? I don't know if anybody's made the connection or not, but this testimony is the apocalypse. Also mentioned last week that prophecy and apocalypse are two different things. The name of this book is Apocalypsis Jesus Christu. It's apocalypse. It tells what is happening in the now. We've just barely got into it. But what I wanted to show this time was at least some of our understanding of Revelation has to grow out of the Olivet prophecies. And really, the good news of the kingdom is found in Revelation chapter 20, a new heaven, a new earth. That which Shroomkopf calls the apocalyptic lie, but I call the apocalyptic encouragement. There, thank you. The good news of the reign. This testimony is the Apocalypse chapter 20 and scattered throughout the world. This is a book that went all over the place. It was written in codex form. It was written in Greek. That tells me my time's up. This is why Yahweh uses the Greek language and the codex form, because Greek was the lingua franca for the whole world, even Rome. And the codex form was inexpensive, just like a book. Pages, okay, all right, I get it. I'm supposed to quit. How do I turn that off? How do you like that? Then shall the end of the age arrive. Starting Masada, ending at Masada. There's an awful lot to this. I'm trying to go and go it little by little. Okay. Now everything's locked up. So I stopped share anyway. No, I'm not going to be embarrassed. What the heck? Let me look at that chat and then we'll be done. Well, these things John, as far as you're predicting the future, that's your business. I can't do that because I can't be sure that I'm not telling somebody lies. But I got to say, your idea about Vesuvius has got something to it. All right? Let me see what else is here. Rabbi Akiva, yeah, it's at snydertalk.com. Yeah, these other things we haven't got to yet, but absolutely, John. You can see the four horsemen of the apocalypse and just about everything that is, it is symbolically or prophetically defined in Revelation has a counterpart in the history as per mainly Josephus, but also Cassius Dio and Tacitus. Yes, I'll send that to you. Oh, yes, I'll put it on. Hold on a second. Akiva was a wretch. Check his life out. They call him the Great One, but he did a lot to destroy any kind of harmony the Jews could have had. Try that. I don't know what this religion, this Snyder Talk guy is, but I've looked at lots of articles in the past from him. They always seem to be really good. So if you got some comments about that, take a look at it and let me know, will you? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Liz. Anything else? If not, I'll close it out till next time. Father Yahweh, we ask that you to illuminate our minds and hearts as we delve deep into your ministries and also try to correct the fallacies that false prophets have brought in your name. Amen. Thank you for coming. Love you.